Labour has never done well in a UK election without doing really well in Scotland.
We need deposit ATMs and we need withdrawal ATMs, and we need a law that means that businesses have to accept cash.
UK workers have had the most bargaining power essentially since the 1970s because the jobs market is so tight.
Can Britain actually afford to maintain a global military presence?
Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Welcome to the programme. Caroline, existential question for you. Do you like September?
I do love September. I love the leaves and I am obsessed with conkers.
Okay. I mean, those are very wholesome reasons to like it.
Yes.
You also have children. So they've gone back to school. That's presumably somewhat of a relief. I'm not going to let you answer that.
The underlying hurrah over the return to school. Yes, it's there.
Well, look, I feel like it's one of those months that has hugely mixed feelings. I spent a long time in France, and this time of year, la rentrée is this thing that spreads so far beyond going back to school. It's every single part of society reboots in September to the point that you get existential after school dread or back to school dread, even though as an adult it's a very long time since you were in school. So I feel like a degree of that happens in the UK, perhaps not to the same extent, but it's certainly a time that we see things heating up again. But this month and this week in particular are actually very unlucky for UK markets.
They are. This is because anyone with a financial bent like us knows that the 19th of September 1992 is Black Wednesday. So you had the sterling crash out of ERM, the exchange rate mechanism, which is a big disaster for the UK.
And you can go back even further than that. On the 21st of September 1931, Britain abandoned the gold standard, which led to a 20% devaluation in the pound.
Yeah, and then Northern Rock, that was another September crisis. So yeah, maybe after August, difficulties strike in September.
But today on the programme, we're looking back on a much more recent anniversary.
So tomorrow marks 1 year since Liz Truss's government announced the so-called mini-budget. It was billed as this radical shift in fiscal policy for Britain, basically to stimulate growth and investment. But investors themselves balked at the announcements from the then Chancellor Kwarteng, and we had the gilt market crisis. Sterling plunged close to parity against the US dollar, and ultimately it all led to the resignation of Liz Truss as Prime Minister.
Here's a reminder of how that all played out.
I will deliver a bold plan to cut taxes and grow our economy.
The markets are watching, and probably more so than at any time since the referendum in 2016.
Today, we have cut stamp duty. We have allowed businesses to keep more of their own money to invest, to innovate and to grow. We have cut income tax and national insurance for millions of workers.
This is the biggest tax-cutting budget since 1972. We didn't expect the additional rate to be cut from 45 to 40p. That is something that the Tories have wanted to do. They just never felt bold enough to. And I mean, you've got to say that it's remarkably brave.
Mr. Speaker, it is unprecedented to have a fiscal statement of this scale with no independent forecasts from the Office for Budget Responsibility. Never has a government borrowed so much and explained so little.
Look at the pound, 110.09. We're pushing lower and lower and lower as the day progresses, down 2.25%. I can't remember seeing these kinds of moves, and we certainly haven't for decades.
What I'm totally focused on is on delivering on the mini-budget, making sure that we get growth back into our economy. I'm not going anywhere.
We need to act now to reassure the markets of our fiscal discipline. I have asked Jeremy Hunt to become the new Chancellor. Now, I recognise we have made mistakes. I'm sorry for those mistakes. But I've fixed the mistakes.
Can you explain to the public why you think you should remain as Prime Minister, given you jumped a key tax cut that led you to be elected and got rid of your Chancellor?
Excuse the bluntness, Prime Minister, but given everything that has happened, what credibility do you have to continue governing?
I am resigning as leader of the Conservative Party.
So that was Liz Truss announcing her resignation on the 20th of October last year after just 44 days in office. And so 1 year on from those events, we sat down with one of the people who actually helped to inspire Trussonomics. That's Mark Littlewood. He first met the Prime Minister at Oxford University in the 90s. He's now Director General of the libertarian think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs. Now, many of the ideas espoused by Truss were supported by the IEA when the mini-budget budget was first announced, Littlewood called it refreshing. We spoke to him a few days afterwards at the Conservative Party conference last year when Truss was still in power. And we've spoken to him in the last few days, a year on, to ask him what he thinks now went wrong.
A million things went wrong, I think. And not all of them are specifically to do with the mini budget. And a lot of them are to do with politics, not economics. On economic grounds, I think there was very good basis for abolishing indeed, the top rate of income tax, the 45p rate. I don't think it's a complete game changer. I don't think it would boost the economy alone, but I think it would be helpful. Tax rates at that sort of level, I doubt, raise any revenue overall. They disincentivise the most productive people in the workforce, and it was worth scrapping it. However, politically, it almost turned into the hill that Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng chose to die on, because they didn't have sufficient support from the Conservative Parliamentary Party to go through with it. You might blame them for not consulting enough with their parliamentary colleagues. There was a lot of questions about the optics of it, the politics of it, if you like, not the economics of it. A backbench rebellion began to brew. The markets start to judge that the government isn't stable. And then you get into a sort of death spiral. If the markets think that the government's going to collapse, that makes the chance of the government collapsing higher still. So I liked the thinking behind the mini budget. I basically agree with the Liz Truss analysis that the biggest problem in our economy has been a lack of growth, and that lack of growth has been because the state's too big, taxes are too high, and the rest of it. But you might say they tried to do, in the name of the Oscar-winning movie, everything, everywhere, all at once, and a more patient approach might have actually yielded better results.
OK, it's interesting, though, that you don't think that the markets were making a judgment on the economics of it, that they were thinking about the politics, about simply the stability of the government. I'm sure any bond trader would say, no, it's about the ability of the government to meet its fiscal obligations and to deliver economically.
Yeah, that's fair. And I think actually on the fiscal side of the ledger, where I was critical, it didn't specifically go to the mini budget, but of the Truss administration, was the colossal size of the energy bailout package. I mean, it was priced at possibly, I think, up to £200 billion. In fact, it hasn't turned out that way. But that didn't seem to spook the markets. It wasn't expanded upon in the mini budget. The mini budget itself carried out the changes that Truss had said she would carry out if she became Conservative leader, namely reversing the corporation tax and the national insurance tax rises. It then did add in a bit more. As I say, the 45p rate, there was a 1p reduction on income tax. But these are not big ticket items in the overall round of things. I mean, even the most static of economic models suggest that top rate of tax would have only cost the Exchequer £2 billion. And if you build in dynamic effects, it probably wouldn't have cost anything at all. So then I think you've got to ask yourself the question, if it wasn't content, was it communications? And here, Caroline, I think you might be onto something. But it wasn't just the mini budget. The Chancellor then sort of appeared on television and said, you ain't seen nothing yet. And they hadn't really produced any coherent workings of their own on sort of what they saw the fiscal position to be. They decided they had to act with such haste that they didn't want the Office for Budget Responsibilities numbers, and I think that's fair enough, but you might argue they didn't provide their own numbers. So they may have given the impression that although in this particular instance, on the particular day of the mini-budget, in the 30 minutes or so that Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng was on his speech, they didn't change very much. They might have communicated the impression, this is just the start, and there are going to be vastly more energy-style handouts and tax cuts in the future. And that, I think, didn't sufficiently underscore a position of fiscal rectitude. The people in the administration will kick back and say, well, we weren't going to reopen the spending review. Inflation would have borne down on real-term spending, the rest of it. But they didn't spell that out particularly clearly to the markets, I think, is a fair criticism.
Do you feel that you lost the battle over tax cuts but won the war on focus on growth, given that we now hear so much from politicians about them putting growth and creating growth as their central priority for the economy?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? You could potentially put the argument that Liz Truss didn't manage to win over her own party as Conservative Prime Minister, but seems to have influenced the narrative of Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves in the Labour Party, that the need for economic growth and the absence of it doesn't explain all of the ills in the United Kingdom. Of course it doesn't. But it explains a lot of them, and it explains why things are so tight and things aren't working and everybody's operating on very thin margins. And I think she has successfully shifted the narrative there. That's now widely accepted. But you can will the end, but do people will the means? And it's all very well to say we want higher growth, but how do you think you get there? At least I think we're going to have that argument.
So that was Mark Littlewood, Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs, speaking to me and to Stephen Carroll. And joining me now to discuss the mini budget, the impact of Liz Truss and what it means now, Bloomberg Senior Executive Editor David Merritt and opinion columnist Marcus Ashworth. Welcome to both of you. David, can I start with you? What do you remember of last year? I saw you slightly head in hands listening to that montage of last year's mini budget and resignation of Liz Truss.
Yeah, it's quite triggering, that montage, wasn't it? I was getting flashbacks of the, because it all, in hindsight, it's all a bit of a blur, but hearing that spelled out, you remember what an extraordinary sequence of events that was a year ago. I remember sitting in the Bloomberg newsroom here watching Kwasi Kwarteng deliver that budget, and it was tax cut after tax cut delivered, I remember, with a certain amount of swagger and confidence. And there was so much in there. I mean, the fact that we call it a mini budget is kind of hilarious. It was the most packed full of kind of big moves of any budget of recent memory. But it took a while for it to sort of sink in what the outcome was going to be. And of course, it was really in the subsequent days when he doubled down and said, I think, didn't he say something like, there's more to come? That was when the markets really started to freak. And I think it was it was exactly a year ago, the 22nd or the 23rd, that the pound hit something like 103 or 104. I mean, we were talking about parity with the dollar for the first time. And of course, then the Bank of England having to step in. That was really the sign for me that things were getting out of control, that the Bank of England was having to effectively prop up the economy overall. So then what do you make, Marcus, of the latest speech, for example, by Liz Truss, where she effectively seemed to double down on her policies, blaming institutional bureaucracy, saying that economic consensus has led to low growth? I mean, even a year on, as we talk about the anniversary, it was not an apology. It was a doubling down on that policy.
I think it needs to be treated with the contempt it deserves. The point of what went wrong is that there was incompetence, both on an economic and political level, of such magnitude. I'm actually quite proud of the British democracy that we were able to spit clearly a dysfunctional government out very quickly. And the Bank of England clearly proved its worth, at least on a institutional financial stability level. A lot of the ingredients bubbling below the surface were put in by the Bank of England, but we can move on to that if we want to. But as far as what Liz Truss is trying to say now, I mean, really, if you wished and believed in what she does, the way she went about it was so atrocious that she put that particular cause back very, very far. I think I enjoyed the tweet this week from, I think, Rupert Harrison, right? Yes. Advisor to George Osborne, and now a candidate, I think, with the Conservative Party, about the sheer brass neck that Liz Truss is able to come out. That was his phrase, not mine. Yes. For her coming out and circling back, sort of doubling down on those policies which caused such chaos. Yeah, and he was criticising the fact that Truss was trying to give advice to Rishi Sunak to cut taxes and to get welfare payments, benefits payments lowered, I suppose. Well, what do you make, though, of the one thing that has shaken out, and perhaps this can be the positive, which is the focus on growth? I mean, Mark Littlewood pointed to it. Is it fair to say that that's the one good thing that has emerged? I've always found this takeaway of Truss a little bit weird. I mean, what politician doesn't want growth in an economy? Which politician has a raft of policies to stagnate the economy? I mean, it was as if she was sort of waving some magic wand. I mean, I think, and this was the thing about that budget, was that everyone commented on afterwards, if it was that easy, why wasn't every government around the world just slashing taxes in order to stimulate demand? So, I think she's obviously painting herself as this kind of prophet of growth, but I feel like that's a little bit off the mark. Yeah. my point is just that there's three elements here: how much you spend, how much you raise tax, and indeed how much you have to borrow. And she tried all three of them at once. And it was the last one, the borrowing bit, which was we've alluded to already in the sense it was Kwasi Kwarteng saying there's much more to come. That spooked the gilt market. Was already worried about a much higher level of borrowing coming through that was going to be even more the following year, at the same time as the Bank of England was going to start selling gilts. The whole thing altogether, too much of everything, huge amounts of spending on obviously they felt needed on the electricity provision, but at the same time you can't then cut taxes and hugely borrow. You've got to do a balance, but really only really focus on one rather than all three.
Yeah, and I think that's a really, really good point, isn't it? Because I think, in a way, in the midst of time, some of those key points, and the ones that are quite complicated, I think, to understand economically, are sometimes lost, or maybe we're rewriting history, all the time. It's always being recast and rewritten. What do you think, Marcus, is the one thing that we're in danger of forgetting, do you think, as the lesson from a year ago?
Well, I just think the whole balance of you go into trying to do something radical as a government, you've got to have the confidence of essentially the bond markets, if you want to number down, but it was the markets generally, I think, that what you're going to do is going to be sustainable, and the borrowing element wasn't. And that's what I think people fail to understand, is that we've had an era of extremely low interest rates, which has enabled a whole lot of leverage to come into our pension industry, which seemingly no one seems to fully understand. And when you start to borrow an awful lot more, you've got to take everyone with you. You cannot go at it like a bull in a china shop. She did not think that the bond markets cared about what she was doing, that she had no worry. They would always be able to borrow.
And yet,
that's the lesson.
Yeah, and yet listening back to some of the interviews that we did around the time, actually, it was one former Chancellor, Philip Hammond, who spoke to Bloomberg, actually right at the start of Liz Truss's administration, who pointed to that issue that the markets were watching. That was his phrase. What do you make of the revision to the OBR, the proposal for Labour, David, if Labour were to win the next general election, that they would want to strengthen the UK's fiscal watchdog, the OBR? This also was one leg missing from the so-called mini-budget.
Yes, we heard it in the montage, right? And this idea that there was no one marking their homework. Remember when George Osborne and David Cameron came in, there was this, the OBR was set up in order to make this political statement that we're the responsible ones. We can shepherd the economy. We're going to have someone else mark our forecasts. And Truss doing away with that or ignoring it. Labour are making a political point here, aren't they? They are painting themselves as the more reliable stewards of the British economy, and saying, look at all the chaos that has ensued in the last year under the Conservatives. We will be far more responsible and beef up that regulator and be even more beholden. They're talking about having kind of fixed budget dates and all these things to try to be tied to the regulator even more tightly. They're just trying to put more distance between themselves, of course, and the Conservatives.
Yeah, well, I think it's a massive mistake, and they've not learned a lesson that the OBR was set up deliberately by Osborne to essentially centralise control of the Treasury and stop all spending departments being able to, should we say, ask or even demand more money. And we've now got a situation where not only we sort of put the cart before the horse, but we turned the cart looking backwards. The whole problem with the Office for Budget Responsibility, and the reason why Kwarteng said there was no need to get an estimate then for the OBR is because they hadn't done with furlough previously. Is one, there wasn't sufficient time, and they knew the data that the OBR was looking at would be faulty. And it's subsequently proved to be that we have a whole issue now. We're reliant on Office for National Statistics data, which is hugely flawed. Even the Bank of England pointed it out yesterday when they decided not to raise rates. They're not confident on the wage data. We know the GDP revisions, which are so huge as to make the whole last 2-3 years almost meaningless in the sense of how you would therefore look forward for future policy. Why would you tie yourself to a set of statistical numbers which feed through from the ONS, the OBR, then to the Treasury to set forward policy? We are creating ourselves into this rigour of a straitjacket which is mental.
David, a last thought then, in terms of just putting into context the mini-budget from last year? Well,
as I said, it's fading into memory, but burned in there, no doubt. And, but continues to have effects. I mean, we're still seeing, we had a Bloomberg survey out this week saying investors are still not trusting UK assets enough as they were before. So, the ripples are still being felt. So that was Bloomberg's head of media editorial, David Merritt, and Bloomberg opinion columnist Marcus Ashworth, speaking to me about, what resonates
resonates since the mini-budget a year ago.
Yeah, and all of the things that we remember about it. Truss's successor, though, Rishi Sunak, and the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt have obviously made growing the economy one of the Prime Minister's top 5 priorities. One widely tipped sector to power that growth is artificial intelligence. So the UK is preparing to host the first global summit on the topic in November. The government confirming this week that they are inviting China to the conference despite opposition from some Conservative backbenchers. Now, the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt's been speaking to Bloomberg about this, as well as a host of other topics, including support for Ukraine and the UK's economic outlook. Anne-Marie Hordern and Joe Matthew asked Jeremy Hunt about the decision to invite the Chinese to the UK's AI summit.
We'll invite them. They won't come to all the discussions, but you need to have a dialogue with countries like China. They're not going to go away. And there may be things that we can work together with China on. But, we have to be very realistic and we have to have those discussions with our eyes open. What we're trying to see is if we can get a global consensus on how to make sure that artificial intelligence remains a massive force for good in the world, which I truly believe it can be. But then if you're going to do that, where you put the guardrails in to stop it going wrong. And the UK has just become the 3rd trillion-dollar tech economy globally. We have more unicorns, these billion-dollar companies than anywhere else in Europe. So we are very keen to bring together all our friends and indeed people whose values we don't share to try and manage this next huge development in humanity's tech journey.
I used to walk by the Silicon Roundabout a lot, but right now you're actually dealing with the titans of Silicon Valley in California. Have you convinced any of them to come to this summit in the United Kingdom?
I think we're going to get most of them coming.
Elon
you're
Musk?
Absolutely right. Well, actually, he's someone I haven't spoken to, but he'd be very, very welcome. But I just say this, we are Europe's Silicon Valley now. Since you lived in London, Anne-Marie, there's been a huge tech explosion. And, we are really proud to be able to make a good contribution to this debate. It's much better that we try and grip this right from the outset. And I think, from the point of view of investment going forward, investors want to see that governments have figured all this stuff out. And then when they do, they're going to start to put in really huge sums of the money. At the moment, we're getting a lot of money being spent by the really big players. And we've got quite a few startups. But if we're really going to make this the huge opportunity it can be, then we need to get some kind of consensus about how to keep it safe.
Chancellor, the UK kept rates unchanged today. Is that the end of what seemed to be an endless cycle of hikes?
Well, just like the US, these things are decided independently. I hope it is. But obviously I have to leave it to the experts in the Bank of England to make the final decision. But I think both in the UK and the US, what you can see is that if you take corrective action and if you stay the course, you can get inflation down. And in both our countries, it's definitely peaked. But it's just so painful getting inflation out of your system. And I think the lesson here is we've just got to stick at it. And then we can get back to the decent growth levels that we all want.
When you look at what's going on in Ukraine and the concerns from U.S. legislatures, I wanted to know from you, as I'm experiencing with some conversations in New York alongside the UN General Assembly, this idea of war fatigue. Are you seeing that in the United Kingdom as well?
We're not. But what I would say to our friends in America is we are incredibly grateful for the global leadership that the United States has shown when it comes to the Ukraine conflict. And I don't think there's a choice, either we focus on Ukraine or we focus on China. The truth is that when you have an aggressor who does something completely unacceptable, tries to tear up international borders, if you're weak when that happens, then you are making the likelihood of conflicts in other parts of the world even higher. And so that's why I think the more the international community stands together when it comes to Ukraine, the less likely we'll have problems elsewhere.
So that was the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt speaking to Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern and Joe Matthew. Well, the government then wants to step up on artificial intelligence. It has actually announced this week the rolling back of some of its green agenda. Rishi Sunak set out what he called a new approach to tackling climate change this week. The move is being seen by many actually as the start of Conservatives campaigning for re-election. So a moment to talk about this with our senior UK government reporter Alex Wickham, who's been looking into it. Alex, good to have you with us. It's a big announcement then. Is it the first? What comes next?
Yeah, we've had Rishi Sunak's 5 pledges this year, famously. Mixed results on those. And now we've got the pivot towards the sort of election campaign, really, as the year ahead plays out. And that number 10 say is going to be a series of bold policy announcements like his climate change announcement this week that they say, will show us Rishi Sunak's political philosophy, his sort of who he is as a person, what his vision for the country is, and create dividing lines with the Labour Party. Create some sort of, clear blue water between Sunak and Keir Starmer, the Labour leader. Quite often, I think sometimes people think there's not too much difference between the two leaders, and the Tories really want to try and show that there is, certainly on some of this more sort of culturally conservative rhetoric. And I think that's what we're going to see in the weeks and months ahead.
Alex, I commend you for your use of clear blue water in that sentence. That's a beautiful deployment of that metaphor. Let's talk about, though, I suppose, is this part of a kind of a well planned out, very structured strategy from the Tories that we're now seeing the start of a rollout of?
Well, if you ask number 10, then yes, they say this has been in the works for months, and this is, he's had a difficult year on the economy front, and now things are slightly improving, with inflation coming down, et cetera, that now he can start to do some of the things that he wants to do as Prime Minister. Number 10 say that Rishi Sunak's been really frustrated about how government works. I mean, how often do we hear Prime Ministers moan about that when things aren't quite going their way? Very often. But, we're going to see things, I think, as they would say, triangulating between a sort of right-wing approach, very, very right-wing approach, and a sort of more do-nothing approach. This sort of mix of him as a, they're trying to sort of define him as a sort of sensible populist, if that could possibly be a thing, where he kind of says, look, we can't go too fast on net zero. We should do net zero, but we've got to do it in a sensible way. And that's sort of a bit of wink, wink, nudge, nudge to the right, who obviously don't like net zero. But it also, number 10 thinks, speaks to a sort of middle ground voter who does like net zero, but also worries about their car and their boiler and that sort of thing. We're going to see similar on HS2, foreign aid, things like that.
Detractors, of course, will say not terribly well planned out because the whole green announcement was rushed because of a leak, it would seem, to the media, and then, a hastily arranged press conference from the Prime Minister. But look, the appeal then to swing voters, do you think it's going to be enough to shift the dial? As you say, this may be the first of more announcements.
This is the problem, I think, is it depends what those other announcements are. Now, there could be things like cutting benefits a bit or cutting the increase in benefits a bit. Things like transgender rights, some things on education that Rishi Sunak thinks are very important. But whether they are enough to shift the dial for voters, to get voters to, turn away from the Labour Party, who have a 20-point poll lead consistently at the moment, back towards the Conservatives is another question. And I'm already hearing from some Tories this week that what voters really care about is, the economy doing well, the NHS working, being able to get a hospital or a GP appointment, the schools and public services not crumbling, the police solving crimes, this sort of thing. And whether rhetoric and things that are kind of sometimes a bit special niche interests of the right wing, whether that's enough to be a strategy to get all voters to be interested, or just the Tory base to come out, is another question. And I think that's the problem for Sunak at the moment, is how does he get beyond, getting the base to come out and vote for him, mitigating defeat, to turning it into a more competitive election where we could get into a territory where, the polls really seriously do close. And that remains to be seen.
Yeah, it's a fascinating scene setter for what we're expecting much more of over the next weeks and months. Alex Wickham, our senior UK government reporter, thank you very much. And you can read more from this, or about this rather, from Alex over the weekend on bloomberg.co.uk or on the terminal.
So look, as we come to the end of this week and thinking all about government actions, it is actually also the start of party conference season. I'm going to be at the Conservative conference, which is the 1st to the 4th of October. So I wanted to mention that. Also, I'm going to be in person at the Labour conference 8th to the 11th of October.
Busy.
Yes, we're going to be busy. We're taking the show on the road, so you've got to download it definitely. But we won't actually be at the Liberal Democrat event that is this weekend in Bournemouth. So I sort of wanted to talk about the agenda for the Lib Dems and give them a little moment. So it's actually their first in-person autumn conference in 4 years, which I hadn't sort of realised, with leader Ed Davey. To counter Rishi Sunak's stop the boat message, apparently the Liberal Democrats have got a motion on the real answer to people trafficking, particularly to combat modern slavery. So that will be one major theme for conference.
Yeah, and of course the Lib Dems very much in ascendance after the by-elections too, so another reason to watch out for the news from that conference. That's it from us for today though. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe, give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Warcock and our audio engineer was Rich Subnani. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more on Monday. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.